In similarity to any other philosophical way of thinking, pragmatism, if we are to consider it as such, can be understood effectively by thinking about it in respect to the following question. What are the philosophical goals which it seeks to achieve, and does it accomplish these goals? When it comes to understanding pragmatism, a little bit of historical context goes a long way. However, this is not something that More chooses to provide when he discusses William James's pragmatism. I shall begin this discussion by providing some contextual information, including the circumstances under which behaviorism was able to exist in the United States, and the way in which that situation was thought of by the Europeans, and the reasons for William James to popularize the movement. Pragmatism would eventually serve as a vehicle to the American behaviorist paradigm. However, that shift doesn't happen until after World War I, and sometime after the papers I will be responding to here were written. After this, hopefully we will have a better framework of understanding to evaluate pragmatism, because as you shall quickly see, some brief historical context encourages us very quickly to realize how dismissive we ought to be of pragmatism as a pseudo-epistemological theory of philosophy, and then may we hopefully begin to criticize it in terms of the very convoluted ideological system that it is. With this information regarding the history of American pragmatism, we may also come to a reasonable understanding of why philosophers like James, More, and also Russell would take interest in, or at least be willing to spend their time writing about pragmatism as a theory regarding meaning, truth, and knowledge. With some context, it will be revealed that pragmatism should instead be understood in terms of being cultural ideology that was devised primarily for its applications in controlling the public and the economy, and its usefulness to the ruling class. In a general, everyday sense, pragmatism could be explained in terms of the sort of thinking we appeal to when we do something we wouldn't otherwise do, except for the fact that in this particular case, it is more convenient to do things this way. James, interestingly, never uses the term convenient in his account of pragmatism. A good paradigm case of the vernacular meaning could be when John decided to wear unmatching socks, forgoing a social norm, because they were his warmest pair not in the washer, and it was cold out. This could be easily said to be an act of pragmatism. In the common sense, to be pragmatic is to act in a way that is practical. However, in the much more conventional philosophical sense, the concept of pragmatism is very, very much stranger, especially when William James is involved. James's pragmatism importantly involves equivocating our sense of the word truth with the word usefulness, and this bizarre epistemological claim results in a very convoluted intellectual scapegoat intended to distract and confound all of the undesirable attention and philosophical scrutiny to which his pragmatist movement may have otherwise been subject. Philosophers like Bertrand Russell are compelled to criticize James's pragmatism on the theoretical level of being a theory of truth, for the same kinds of reasons that James was given to propagate the pragmatist movement in the first place. In Russell's case, as a British analytic philosopher, he is prohibited from confronting the pragmatism on ideological grounds, due to an agreement which he was able to land with the British government towards the preservation of British analytic philosophy. That philosophy could remain a discipline concerned solely with the pursuit of knowledge via philosophical rigor, so long as the British philosophers didn't write about any politically charged topics, such as brainwashing and controlling the masses, for example. So how exactly did pragmatism, by which I mean in the specific sense of James's American pragmatism, come to be a thing that exists? What were the things which caused it to emerge, not only as a concept, but as a driving source of American politics? Well, as I understand it, a particularly important point of interest regarding the origin of American pragmatism will be the aftermath of the First World War. The ruling class Americans were troubled by a small percentage of the vote in an election supporting the anti-war candidate, and so a decision was made to tighten the grip of American patriotism over freedom of thought amongst the masses. American culture needed to be something that could be programmed and controlled to some extent for the benefit of the wealthiest people in the world, like the wealthy and prominent Rockefeller family. The measures after World War I were taken as a reaction to the historical pragmatist context. However, pragmatism was not yet fully in place in the 19th century. Philosophical pragmatism, which already existed due to the work of an American philosopher named Peirce, was politically restructured and popularized in the United States by William James. Following World War I, Quine, author of the famous philosophical essay Two Dogmas of Empiricism, published in 1951, had been recognized as an ideal means to accomplish a much more complete indoctrination of the American populace, and likewise, earlier in history, James was given the task of its administration to the cultural matrix of the United States of America. The pragmatism which James promoted affected the American education system in many ways, including the division of math and the hard sciences from the humanities and soft sciences. Conveniently for the power group, this discourages the rigorous application of knowledge to political issues, discouraging dissidency and revolution, but still allows for math and science to exist within their capacities as academic disciplines. By divorcing the STEMS programs from literacy of the humanities, the power group is able to maintain control over the application and target of systemic and logical research, and they do this in such a way that is structured to maximize their wealth and affluence, often to the expense of the welfare and interests of the public as well as to the neglect of natural environments. Over time, education systems were understood to be more purposed around providing you with the training and documentation needed to fill a certain socioeconomic niche, earning good money and living well, or to serve as a functioning part of the development of a new alternative trivial system, dedicated to the management and maintenance of the capitalist paradigm, as opposed to furthering humanity's knowledge or uncovering truths of the universe. Some important moves were made during this time frame. From the 1930s onwards to the 40s, it was no coincidence that America was eager to grab up whatever great European minds that they were able to by consequence of the war, and people were taking refuge in America because of it. Those that did come over to America were put in positions where they would flourish, but also be alienated from the American people in such a way that the public wouldn't be concerned that these people were so much more scholastically advanced than the Americans. European analytic philosophers such as More and Russell, on the other hand, reacted to James's philosophy of pragmatism in ways that were oppositional as well as limited in their scope. Making use of his position of administrative authority as the head philosopher of Britain, Russell had been able to come up with a negotiation with the British government such that they would preserve the historical British idealism by a rejection of American pragmatism, such that a rigorous application of logic would be continued to be needed by the public and taught by the education systems. The government agreed to this, so long as the British analytic philosophers would refrain from applying their practical methods of logic and critical analysis to politically charged issues, and by contrast to how it was to be in the American education systems under James's pragmatist regime, where the rigorous application of logic was to become a skill exclusive to only math and the hard sciences. It was important to the Europeans not to undermine James's American pragmatism, as America's ruling class had decided to structure the culture on that basis since it rendered the American people less educated and easier to control. This was undoubtedly largely because of the massive industrial power of the United States, which came as a result of the behaviorist pragmatist approach towards structuring of factories and the production of goods and services in the context of their industrial capitalist nation. British analytic philosophers such as Russell and More are very compelled to challenge James's pragmatism by virtue of their nature. However, they are forced to do so under the false pretense that James's pragmatism is a sophisticated and compelling work of theoretical philosophy, and not just a bunch of seductively phrased ideology. It is interesting to compare the ways in which More and Russell react against James's pragmatism. Russell's philosophical strategy involves taking broad and generalizing sweeps over James's pragmatism as a whole, and only picks at the aspects of James's pragmatism regarding truth being usefulness, using a combination of arguments and abstractions of his intuition. At times, Russell seems tantalizingly close to explicitly suggesting that James's pragmatism is meant to be a vehicle of American ideology rather than a philosophical theory concerning truth, but in faithfulness to his agreement with the British government, he never does so directly. Russell's philosophical response to James's pragmatism challenges it in a very broad scope, in ways which are less characteristic of classic British philosophy than More's. In William James's pragmatism, More applies a very rigorous logical treatment to one particular aspect of James's pragmatism, the conceptual equivocation of usefulness and truth. By writing many more pages than Russell, whilst responding to far less of James's philosophical material, More arguably does a lot better, or at least much more thorough job of debunking James's pragmatism, at least in terms of its equalization of truth and usefulness. Unfortunately, neither Russell nor More's criticism of James' pragmatism were very effective in exposing the dubious true nature and purpose of James's pragmatism. But it is interesting that they both write in such a way that not only condemns it very harshly, but also seems to discreetly pose cynical questions about why such a view would be taken so seriously to begin with. The sarcastic rhetoric seems relatively more prevalent and prominent in Russell's reaction to James. However, More is more meticulous and unrelenting in his criticism of the prevalent so-called logic of James's said-to-be philosophy of pragmatism. More begins his precise and extensive dismantling of James's pragmatism in his essay with the following statement. My object in this paper is to discuss some of the things which Professor William James says about the truth in the recent book which he has given the above name Pragmatism. More continues in saying, in Lecture 4 James professes to give an account of a theory which he calls the pragmatist theory of truth, and he professes to give a briefer preliminary account of the same theory in Lecture 2. A few things to say about this opening statement. First of all, it is implicitly apparent from the start that More is not going to agree with James about his pragmatism. He addresses James as Professor James throughout the paper, and also as one who professes to give an account of a theory, and an even briefer preliminary account of the same theory. Unfortunately, this is likely about as close as More will get to calling James out in the sense that his pragmatism is an ideological system designed to add a substantial degree of control over the American people, and that the debate about pragmatism is as a theoretical philosophy concerning the truth is not a serious one, but rather a farce intended to disguise the true nature of the state of affairs in American politics. Before subjecting More to further scrutiny, it is important to recall that More has his hands tied with respect to how he is able to respond to James, based on the agreement between Russell and the British government that enabled British analytic philosophy to continue to exist. More knows how to apply his logic, but he is prohibited from applying it to any sorts of politically charged issues or situations due to Britain's non-interventionistic stance towards the American indoctrination of pragmatism. Given that James's pragmatism, as well as the entailed essay on the subject which he is responding to, are both cleverly packed ideology and carefully selected suggestive rhetoric material under the guise of a work of theoretical philosophy. For this reason, my criticism of More's response to James will be in some ways less concerned with the quality of his arguments insofar as squabbling with James about how truth and usefulness are not synonymous words, and the extent to which he is able to show it to be ridiculous and incorrect to equivocate them. As More will demonstrate, James's theoretical pragmatism, as I shall henceforth refer to his attempts to describe the truth in terms of usefulness, and related endeavors, does not hold up well to any sort of logical scrutiny whatsoever, especially not against good methods of British analytic philosophy like those of More. More generally does a good critical analysis of James's theoretical pragmatism, at least insofar as most of the points he chooses to make and the resulting arguments he makes. More takes the position that James's theoretical pragmatism is very misguided and hopelessly confused in terms of its logical coherence, and makes a very compelling case using several long-winded and thorough philosophical evaluations of specific aspects of James's theory. If his principal aim in writing this was to expose the incoherent rubbish of James's work without collapsing into prohibited ideological discourse, such that his leaders would be appeased, then we can assume that More thought the best option for opposing James would be to completely and ruthlessly dismantle his theoretical philosophy, which would hopefully expose him for his intellectual fraudulence, at least to those who were more educated echelons of society at large. More does so to such an extent that if the reader is aware of what is happening as a result of his philosophical work, that they might be significantly encouraged to consider James, or at least his intellectual materials regarding pragmatism, to be jokes, laughably misguided, and not something to be taken seriously. With any luck, perhaps More's response to James would even be enough to sway some of the thinkers of more prominent influence in society who were supporting James. To James's credit, and by virtue of his understanding of human psychology, he was able to structure and disguise his arguments regarding pragmatism in such a way that made them very seductive and palatable even to people who were well educated at the time. One instance of weakness on More's part is given near the very beginning of his paper when he misinterprets James's theoretical pragmatism in the sense that he tells us James asserts that our ideas are true, he seems to say, are those that work in the sense that they are or can be verified or are useful. This is setting things up on a false premise, because James is only concerned with defining truth in terms of usefulness, or even expedience, as he later phrases it, and verifiability is a different thing that James does not mention, and verifiability-based account of truth would be an entirely different can of worms in this context. Despite this initial error, More is very effective in providing a rigorous treatment of James's pragmatism as his theoretical pragmatism, and shows that it is clearly and extensively erroneous in very critical ways. Defining truth in terms of verifiability would be much more reasonable than what James is doing, since to verify means to show to be true. James undoubtedly introduces that jargon of verification in order to confuse the reader of his pragmatism testimony and make his account sound more impressive by obscuring the fact that it is based on something outlandishly ridiculous. One example of this comes very shortly after More's systematic mucking out of the jargon of verification, stating that Professor James means to assert not merely that we can verify all our ideas, but also that all ideas which we can verify are too, and so too with utility or usefulness. This would follow, for one thing, from the fact that he seems to use the words verification or verifiability and usefulness as if they came to the same thing, and then immediately stating, but in this case too, he asserts it in words that have but one plain meaning. The true, he says on page 222 of his essay, Pragmatism, is only expedient in our way of thinking. The truth is only that which is expedient. Or again, an idea is true, and I quote, so long as to believe it could be profitable to our lives, on page 75 of his Pragmatism. This is the same kind of rationale which could be used to justify something as morally dubious as slavery. And in fact it was. After taking advantage of these particularly juicy and revealing quotes of James, More quickly reverts back into his applying of analytic methodology and provides a critical analysis using methods of counterexamples that is sufficient to conclusively dismiss James's position that he has just been quoting. The majority of the remaining pages of More's treatment of James's pragmatism, or more specifically of James's philosophical essay on the subject, end up being more of the same, identifying problems with James's theoretical pragmatism and showing that it resultingly falls apart through a rigorous application of logic. At this point, it seems prudent to take a step back from More's logical reflection rejection of James's pragmatism through a systematic dismantling of his arguments and examine the bigger picture. Although More's argumentative strategy was good, and his methods were uncompromising, an important question remains to be asked. To what extent did More impact the onset of James's pragmatism in the world, particularly in America, as well as amongst prominent thinkers? It seems safe to assume that More did have some kind of his own agenda that was anti-James or anti-American pragmatism, regardless of the sanctions imposed by his government. But I say so only in light of some historical context and what I consider to be the frustrated and sarcastic voice More chooses to write with. In terms of being a political activist, if we are to regard More as having that in mind as a pedagogical goal, the precise nature of his specific philosophical aim, if he can be said to have such a thing, remains rather undefined other than being very oppositional to James's theoretical framework. It makes sense to assume a role of constrained political activism on the part of all the analytic thinkers who were concerned about any theoretical philosophy as boneless as James's pragmatism, because otherwise they would be inclined to make better use of their philosophical work, such as Russell does in his Principia Mathematica. Perhaps Russell gives us a better treatment of James's pragmatism in that regard, in spite of his own debunking of James's so-called theoretical arguments being less sound than More's from an analytic perspective. As far as I'm concerned, the results of More's work is very clear, at least with respect to the obvious objections that he makes, as he phrases them in the opening of his essay in response to James. Moore tells us what he is going to discuss, namely James's ideas, and he does so rigorously and in a way that is destructively critical. He tells us about James's pragmatist theory of truth, and that he means to discuss it, and it becomes very clearly established as conclusively dismissible from a variety of angles as a result of his discussion. The point I'm trying to make here is that Moore simply decided to make an attack on James's pragmatism, which is obvious, and stuck to the very traditional British analytic methods in doing so. The final result was a very conclusive debunking of James's theoretical philosophy, albeit one that is less concerned with the bigger picture and more concerned with showcasing the extent of how very wrong James is with respect to his theoretical philosophy in what is supposedly a very compelling work, since it was highly influential and its status still remains important today, astonishingly as part of the curriculum of important contemporary topics in philosophy, rather than as a historical political movement of great significance to the United States. At the end of the day, I'm not sure what would give me the credentials to criticize Moore's choice when it came to how he would approach these things, since I was not there at the time, and also my speech here is not being compelled and appeal to rules set in motion by government officials. All I can say is that he obviously met the goals which he obviously set. He took a position in the debate, albeit a debate that was intended to distract the public from what was really going on, and he defended it adamantly using what was, for the most part, a sound analytic approach.